Hey everybody. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about restructuring and globalization. I'm having this follow up the corporate level strategies section because you do have lots of corporations that are national. You also have a lot of corporations that become international, multinational, whatever it is that you want to call them. So it just really makes sense for this to follow up on the corporate level strategies section. So when we're talking about, so last time when we were talking about corporate level strategies, I gave you 4 different ways that we often do those. With regard to international corporate level strategies, we have a couple of different sort of options there. Some of these are going to be multi-domestic. Now, when we talk about that, we really have, and again, I did kind of mention these previously, our multi-domestic corporate level strategies really has to do with decentralizing decisions to business units in each country, which is really good because it gives these companies the opportunity to tailor their services, their products, whatever it may be, to local markets. Now, this is a little bit different with our hospitality and tourism types of organizations. It's not always so easy to do this. Most hospitality, tourism, events types of organizations tend to be either global or transnational. So global corporate level strategies are controlled by the home office. Typically, you have standardized products and services that are offered across country markets. So there's not a whole lot of difference in terms of what they are offering. Transnational corporate level strategies, really this is kind of a mix of the two. So you do have this primary focus on global efficiency, but at the same time you do have this local representation and local responsiveness in there, which is really important. Now, in terms of how companies, how corporations try to enter markets internationally, there's a few different ways that they do this. Now, some of these don't tend to apply quite so much to T&E organizations, but I'm going to go over them anyway, just so you have an idea. So the first one is exporting. Naturally, this has to do primarily with products. So for instance, if you work for a winery or some kind of retail distribution, something like that, if you're a food service provider, which I mean, certainly some of our students do go into that, then you may be looking at exporting products to other places. The challenge with this is that once a product leaves your purview, it tends to be rather high cost to get it to wherever it's going, and you have low control over what's happening when it gets there. So that is obviously primarily based on products, so not so much that you guys are going to have to worry about if you're in the hotels or anything like that. Now, licensing, these are kind of progressing a little bit. So licensing is one way, again, more so for products, getting into an international market. One of the actually best examples of licensing had to do with cigarettes in China. So a lot of Western countries, you know, because of this health focus and recognizing the health risks of cigarettes, there was less and less interest in, you know, these Western countries to produce cigarettes. However, China loves cigarettes. They're big smokers over there. So as the Western markets were shrinking, the China market was actually growing quite big. So what they ended up doing is they ended up doing a lot of licensing arrangements with cigarette producers in the US or the UK or wherever it may be, Europe, that kind of thing. This is a little bit easier in the terms that, in the sense that it tends to be lower cost than exportation, it tends to be lower risk. There, of course, are low returns because you're licensing, you're not just producing something and then exporting it, you're selling the license, sort of the intellectual property to somebody else. And as such, you end up having little control. So the exporting, the licensing tends not to be used quite so much in hospitality and tourism. We do a lot of the strategic alliances, mergers and acquisitions, and then in some cases we do these new wholly owned subsidiaries. So let me go ahead and get into some of those. So some of you are probably familiar with strategic alliances. If you've ever flown on an airline, you probably are very familiar with them. So strategic alliances are generally, it's an agreement between 2 or more companies to work towards some kind of common objective. Now, there's 2 different kinds of strategic alliances. One is an equity-based alliance. That's what we call a joint venture. I'll get to that in a second. The other is what we call a non-equity alliance. And I gave you two examples of non-equity alliances below. So you have One World, and then you have the Star Alliance. So the vast majority of major airlines fall into one of these two alliances. Now, here's the thing, particularly with non-equity alliances, they really don't produce a massive competitive advantage. What they really do is they kind of reduce the disadvantage, the potential disadvantage. So in other words, it makes it easier, and that's why the airlines do this so much, is because an airline, it's so hard, even the biggest airlines, to have routes everywhere. And since they certainly have limitations, there's political and economic reasons not to be able to be represented in every country and every city, that sort of thing. That's why they have these alliances, because they don't want to lose customers. They want to make it easier for their customers to travel, but they want to maintain their business. So this is examples of non-equity alliances. They get minimal sort of money advantage, but it helps them maintain customers because it's easier for their customers to book and get to go exactly where they want to go, even if their chosen airline can't fly there. So let's talk about equity alliances, which is what we call joint ventures. So in most cases, joint ventures are between two parties. It might be between more, but most often between two parties, and they're working together on one particular project. And the idea is that they're supposed to both be equally invested in terms of time, money, effort. So it might be research that they're doing, it might be human resources that they're putting in, whatever it may be. A lot of times these are somewhat smaller projects, though when I give you a couple of examples in a little while, they're not going to seem very small, but relatively small projects in comparison to the corporation or the business units themselves. And very often these projects are time-bound. Now, not always, but very often they do end up, even if they don't say, okay, this is going to go until 2030, very often technology changes or the environment changes, and so it just kind of is no longer needed, and they decide to cease the joint venture. This does certainly happen. So the benefit to this is that it kind of reduces the risk of one company taking over an entire project. This is particularly important when costs are really high. These two organizations, they can share the costs. And then, of course, if it is successful, they get to share all of the profits as well. But they're basically pulling all of the capital that they have. They're pulling their expertise. They're working together and reducing their risk to hopefully have a successful project. Now, there's a couple of different reasons that companies do these joint ventures. In some cases, you have them wanting to enter new markets, so they might be entering new markets. They might be wanting to enter existing markets, and then of course we've got these existing products and these new products that they may be considering. So basically when we have new markets and existing products, we're basically trying to take existing products into a new market. We may be using new products and diversifying into new markets. We might have an existing product and an existing market. We basically want to work together to strengthen what we've got. And then in a lot of cases, we're talking about new products coming into existing markets and trying to work from there. So here are a couple of examples of joint ventures. So BMW and Toyota worked quite a bit with regard to building the technology for electric cars. They've also done quite a few other things regarding cars with, I don't know, hydrogen fuel, or I really don't know anything about cars. But anyway, I know that they've done quite a few projects together. Google and NASA worked together to develop Google Earth. So that's pretty well taken care of now. A lot of the Hollywood studios have worked together, even though they're competitors, they're working together to, put that public service announcement out there to fight internet piracy or piracy. But one of the biggest joint ventures in the hospitality industry is, for instance, Bulgari and Marriott. So Bulgari is, if you're unfamiliar, they're a very famous jewelry maker, and what they did is they partnered with Marriott, so they put together a joint venture. They only have about 15 or 20 Bulgari resorts. In some cases they're resorts, in some cases they're hotels, in some cases they're residences. They're typically in very high-end locations, so Milan, Dubai, London, Moscow, those sorts of places, and they're obviously very expensive to stay there. So that's an example of a joint venture. And it's actually a good one because it's not necessarily two hotel companies working together. It's two different types of businesses coming together for a joint venture. Okay, so probably the biggest thing that we see, and I cannot even tell you how many mergers and acquisitions I've seen since I have come into the industry over 20 years ago. So mergers are when you have two companies that are independent and they decide to come together. It's mutually agreed upon. They consolidate under joint ownership. So in some cases, they do take the name of both companies. In some cases, one company trumps the other. In other cases, they rename themselves. There's lots of different ways they do that, but I do have a video that you guys are supposed to be watching about mergers and acquisitions. So typically, mergers are seen as a good thing. Acquisitions, to a certain extent, are often seen as kind of negative, not necessarily negative, but hostile, in the sense that the view is that somebody is a loser and somebody's a winner, and that's not necessarily true, okay? With acquisitions, the idea is that you have one organization that has all of the money and the power, and what they do is they start buying shares in the other company, and then an agreement is made, and then they essentially buy all of the shares or the vast majority of the shares, and therefore they get to have decision-making power over the other company. So I did give you a reading on the Marriott acquisition of Starwood and how that worked out. So even though that's an acquisition, that did not turn out to be really negative. It wasn't like there was a major winner or loser. So there's lots of different ways and different reasons for acquisitions, how they happen, why they happen, and how likely they are to achieve success. A lot of times it comes down to money, okay, and it comes down to market share. So very often, particularly with mergers and acquisitions, you have a brand that is very well known and very well established, and so the other company may have more money and they're essentially buying the properties and the brand name to a large extent. I worked for Caesars in Las Vegas. We were actually bought by Harrah's. Harrah's had a lot more money, but Caesars had the brand name and everybody knew us. So even though we were acquired by Harrah's, in the end, they ended up naming the company Caesars because it was so well known. So there's lots of different ways and reasons for acquisitions. However, there are some potential problems that can happen, with, how successful those may be. So I just put this table in there as well with regard to attributes and some results of different types of acquisitions that may happen. I mean, ideally, like number 2, you want an acquisition to be friendly. When that happens, it makes things a lot easier, okay? It ends up being a lot faster with integrating. Very often, kind of the costs are a bit lower. It's really good if the merged firm has, like number 5 over here, the merged firm has lower debt. In that case, the company that's purchasing them or acquiring them has to worry about, lower financing costs, and there's lower risks of things like bankruptcies, those kinds of things. So it is important for you guys to understand these concepts, because if you work for any kind of corporation, if you work for a small business, it's not likely to be an issue for you, but you certainly may be acquired by a larger organization. But you guys should get familiar with these terms, because every company that I've ever worked for has been involved in a strategic alliance, a joint venture, a merger, or an acquisition. It is just the way of the world. That is the way these things happen. You have no idea how many of the products you buy under a brand name have been acquired by a different parent brand. So it's just very typical. You don't necessarily know that it's happened, but that's just the way companies work. That's how they gain market share, and that's the way that they expand. So you really need to get comfortable with this idea, because I can almost guarantee all of you will deal with this at least once in your professional careers. So you should be well aware of what happens. Okay, that's it for that. Please make sure you take a look at all of the other videos and readings for this week so that you're well prepared for our tutorial in a few days. Thanks so much. Have a good one, everybody.